Keanu Reeves had seen it all. The red carpets, the flashing cameras, the fawning fans. He was no stranger to the limelight. But today, he wasn't interested in any of it. This wasn't a publicity tour or a press junket. It was just him, boarding a luxury jet for a private flight to an undisclosed location. A break from the chaos, a moment of peace in the midst of an ever-demanding world. The jet's sleek exterior gleamed in the sunlight as he stepped onto the tarmac, his casual clothes, jeans, a hoodie, and sunglasses, blending seamlessly with the quiet elegance of the aircraft. No one around seemed to notice him as he made his way toward the door, and that was exactly how he liked it. He didn't need the attention, didn't crave the spotlight. Keanu simply wanted to travel in peace. He'd flown private many times, but this one felt different. Something was off. It wasn't the jet, nor was it the crew. It was something about the way the woman, standing at the entrance of the jet, looked at him. She was in her late 20s, with sharp features and a no-nonsense attitude that screamed, "I've seen it all." But there was something in the way she glanced at him, almost like he wasn't even worth noticing. As Keanu approached, she didn't greet him with the usual warmth and respect afforded to a VIP. Instead, she scanned him up and down as if evaluating his worth. "Name?" she asked curtly, her voice cold, her gaze unyielding. Keanu paused for a moment. A part of him wondered if she had recognized him but was too prideful to show it. But then again, maybe she didn't recognize him at all. It wasn't like everyone knew every celebrity. Despite his fame, there were plenty of people who were too busy or uninterested to care. "Keanu Reeves," he said calmly, his voice betraying no hint of annoyance. He wasn't here to make a scene. He simply wanted to get on the plane and enjoy the solitude that came with it. The woman raised an eyebrow. "And your seat?" she asked, her tone even more condescending now, as if she didn't believe he belonged here at all. Keanu nodded towards the boarding pass in his hand, offering it without a word. She glanced at it briefly, then back at him, her eyes narrowing. This seems wrong," she muttered, clearly skeptical. He resisted the urge to sigh. This was a luxury jet, for crying out loud. A private charter meant for the rich, the powerful, the famous. And yet, here he was, being treated like a nobody. "You're in the wrong seat," she said, her voice thick with judgment. "I'll need to check with the captain." Keanu's heart sank slightly, but he didn't let it show. He could feel the familiar sting of being misunderstood, of having to prove his worth when it was already obvious. He wasn't just Keanu Reeves, the actor who had spent decades building his career. In moments like this, he felt like he was simply a person like anyone else. No special treatment, no recognition, just someone trying to get through life as quietly as possible. "Is there a problem?" Keanu asked, keeping his tone polite but firm. The woman, not recognizing the man she was speaking to, looked at him with a mix of arrogance and indifference. "Just wait here, okay? I'll sort this out," she said dismissively, as if he were just another passenger. Keanu stood there, his mind racing. Should he just let it go and accept the humiliation? He could, of course. But there was a part of him that was tempted to reveal his identity, partly to settle this awkward situation, partly out of a desire to prove a point. In his years of being treated like a celebrity, this was the first time in a long while that he had been so thoroughly dismissed. And it stung. He stood there, waiting, as she walked away with his boarding pass, oblivious to the fact that the man she had just belittled was the very person who had built the industry she worked in. He could feel the tension building, the subtle unease growing inside him. All he wanted was a peaceful flight, but now he wasn't sure if he could get it. At least not until something was settled. What would happen when she realized the truth? Would she apologize? Would it change anything? Keanu had no idea, but he was about to find out. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Keanu Reeves wasn't always the calm, composed actor people saw in front of the camera. He didn't wake up one morning to find himself on a jet, surrounded by luxury and adoration. The journey to this moment had been anything but smooth. And while he had become a household name, much of his life had been shaped by hardship and loss, lessons that were far deeper than anything a Hollywood script could offer. Born in Toronto to an English mother and a father who struggled with addiction, Keanu's early years were anything but easy. He often found himself being raised by his mother, who worked tirelessly to support him. His father had long disappeared from their lives, and Keanu was left with a sense of abandonment that would stick with him for years. As a child, Keanu had always been a quiet, introspective person. His love for the arts grew early. His escape from the complexities of life often found in the pages of a book or the lens of a camera. He wasn't the kind of kid who was drawn to flashy things. His world was small and filled with dreams of becoming someone who could use his experiences to inspire others. Acting was his way of making sense of a world that never quite seemed to make sense to him. But there were many times when the weight of his childhood would come rushing back. He remembered the day he lost his sister, Kim, to leukemia, a day that changed him forever. Kim had been his closest friend, and losing her in his early 20s was an agony he never fully recovered from. It was a grief that left scars, not just emotionally, but spiritually, and it was something he kept hidden from the public eye. Through all the ups and downs of his career, Keanu never forgot the lessons he learned during those early years. He was taught that life wasn't about fame or wealth. It was about the relationships you built, the people you loved, and the resilience it took to keep going when everything felt like it was falling apart. The humble foundation he had been raised on, despite its pain, gave him a groundedness that many around him lacked. In Hollywood, where egos clashed and superficiality was often the norm, Keanu stood out. He didn't buy into the fame game, didn't engage in the constant search for validation from others. He was one of the rare celebrities who seemed to float above the noise, earning respect not from grand gestures, but from his consistent, humble nature. But as much as he tried to keep his life private, there were always those moments, those glaring reminders, that fame followed him everywhere. The flashes of cameras, the gossip, the assumptions that came with his name. Even in his personal life, relationships had been strained. After the death of his sister, his romantic relationships became difficult, with partners struggling to understand the depths of his pain. There was no escape from his past, and no matter how much he achieved, Keanu could never fully outrun the shadow it cast over him. It was with these thoughts that Keanu found himself on a plane, boarding a luxury jet without the usual fanfare. He had never been one for unnecessary attention, and so he often flew under the radar, hoping for some peace and quiet away from the chaos that was his career. But today, that peace was being challenged, and the woman at the door, the one who didn't recognize him, who treated him like any other passenger, seemed to be the catalyst. As he waited for her to return, Keanu couldn't help but think about how far he had come, and yet, how much further there was still to go. Fame had afforded him many opportunities, but it had also created barriers between him and the world he once knew. He had learned over the years to stay grounded, to remember where he came from, and to never let the superficiality of his surroundings define who he was. And now, here he was, treated like a nobody by someone who had no idea who he was. For a moment, a small, almost ironic smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Is this what it feels like to be invisible? His mind wandered to all the times he'd felt invisible in his life. Not because he was unnoticed, but because there had been moments where he felt like he wasn't seen for who he truly was, the person beyond the public persona, beyond the famous face. In a strange way, being overlooked now, in this moment, was oddly comforting. It reminded him of who he was before the fame, before the screens and flashing lights. Keanu wasn't just a movie star. He was a man who had lost, who had learned, who had struggled, and who had kept going, no matter what. The woman who had treated him like just another passenger didn't know any of that. She didn't know the late nights he spent working on his craft, or the grief he had buried deep inside him, or the years spent trying to find peace within himself. But maybe that's the way it should be, he thought. Maybe it was better that people didn't know who he was. Maybe it was time for him to see how the world truly treated him when he wasn't Keanu Reeves, the celebrity, but just a regular person. It was, after all, what he had always wanted. As the woman returned, holding his boarding pass in one hand and looking slightly flustered, Keanu knew that whatever was about to happen next, he would face it with the same calm resolve he had learned to carry through life. The woman returned with a slightly flustered look, her sharp eyes still scanning him with that same skepticism. Keanu couldn't quite place what it was about her. Maybe it was the way she held herself like she was in control of everything, or maybe it was the simple fact that she couldn't even offer him the courtesy of recognition. But whatever it was, the tension in the air seemed to grow thicker as she approached. "I'm sorry for the confusion," she said, her voice losing some of its earlier bite, but not much. "There was a small mix-up with the seat assignments. I'll need you to follow me, please." Keanu nodded quietly, trying not to show how irritated he was. This wasn't just about the mix-up. It was about the way she had dismissed him so quickly. He didn't mind being treated like a regular person. He wasn't above anyone, and he never had been. But there was something about the way she had judged him that didn't sit right with him. "Of course," he said softly, keeping his tone neutral. She turned sharply and led the way down the narrow aisle of the luxurious jet, her heels clicking sharply on the polished floor. Keanu followed, keeping his distance, but as he walked, he noticed the subtle shifts in the air. The other crew members, who had been busy preparing the plane, suddenly looked up. Some glanced nervously at him, and others subtly turned their heads to avoid his gaze. It was clear that they all knew who he was. But why had she not? As they reached the seat, she turned to face him again, her expression unreadable. "You'll be seated here," she said, pointing to an empty chair by the window, far from the luxury section that many celebrities would usually occupy. The seat was perfectly fine, but the idea that she had placed him so far back while treating other passengers with more reverence stung. Keanu glanced around. The luxurious decor, the plush seating arrangements, and the peaceful hum of the jet. This was a world he was used to. But it wasn't just the seat that bothered him. It was the underlying implication that he wasn't worthy of the better seats. He took a deep breath, trying to push down his frustration. Maybe it was best to just let it go. After all, the flight was supposed to be about getting away from everything, not getting tangled in another awkward interaction. But as he sat down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The space between him and the rest of the passengers felt like a silent commentary on how the world saw him now. Not as the revered actor he was, but as just another face in the crowd. The woman, still standing in the aisle, hadn't moved. Her arms were crossed, and her stance suggested she was waiting for something. Keanu glanced up, raising an eyebrow. "Is there anything else?" he asked, the calmness of his voice betraying the storm of thoughts racing through his mind. She paused for a moment, eyeing him again. The unspoken tension between them was palpable. She wasn't quite ready to back down. Her lips parted as if she was about to say something, but then she hesitated. Finally, she spoke. I just wanted to double-check something," she said, her tone slightly softer now, but still cold. Are you sure you're Keanu Reeves?" Keanu blinked, surprised at her directness. "Yes, I'm sure." Her eyes flickered over him, this time lingering just a little longer. For the first time, there was a hint of uncertainty in her expression. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." She trailed off, clearly flustered by the realization. But it wasn't an apology, more of an admission that she'd misjudged him. Keanu wasn't interested in making her feel worse, though part of him wanted to see her face when she realized who she had been so dismissive toward. Still, he chose to let it slide. He didn't want to escalate this. This wasn't about her. It was about him. "It's fine," he said, offering a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I understand. Happens to all of us." His words were light, but the undertone of the moment felt heavier than he had expected. It wasn't the first time he'd been dismissed in this way, but something about the coldness in her attitude was making this encounter feel different. For a moment, there was silence between them. The hum of the jet's engines filled the void, and Keanu could feel the eyes of the other passengers subtly shifting in his direction. He could tell that some were whispering to one another, trying to figure out if the person sitting near the back was really Keanu Reeves. The absurdity of it all struck him again. Here he was, on a private jet, trying to escape the chaos, only to be thrown into a situation that was far from peaceful. The woman finally nodded, though her posture was still stiff, as if unsure what to do with herself now. "I'll just let you settle in, then." Keanu settled into his seat, looking out the window. He wasn't sure what had made this encounter stand out. It wasn't the seating mix-up or even her blatant disregard for who he was. It was the sheer absurdity of being treated as if he were a nobody, a face lost among countless others. He had come to expect it in some circles. People often didn't recognize him, or they chose to ignore him out of embarrassment. But for the first time in a long while, this felt different. It wasn't just about the recognition. It was about the pride in being seen as just a person rather than a celebrity, and how that pride had somehow turned into a moment of humiliation. Keanu sighed, pushing back against the seat as the jet began to taxi down the runway. He wasn't sure what he was hoping for anymore. Peace? Recognition? Respect? Maybe, just maybe, what he was hoping for was something far simpler. To be treated like a human being, no more, no less. As the jet soared into the sky, the soft turbulence a reminder of the unpredictability of life, Keanu felt an odd sense of both relief and unease. He didn't know it yet, but this flight, this seemingly insignificant moment, was about to become a turning point in his journey, one that would reveal something unexpected and profoundly life-altering. The jet leveled out, cutting through the clouds with a smooth, almost effortless glide. The sun's rays shone through the windows, casting a soft, golden hue on the plush interior. For a moment, it felt as if the world had paused. There was no paparazzi, no flashing cameras, no demands. Just the steady hum of the jet's engines and the hum of his own thoughts. Keanu sat back in his seat, trying to shake off the unease that had followed him since boarding. The woman, whose name he still didn't know, had disappeared into the cockpit, leaving him alone in the relative quiet of the cabin. For now, the only sounds were the occasional murmur of the crew as they went about their business, ensuring the flight was smooth. But his mind wasn't at ease. The strange encounter with the woman still hung heavily in the air. He could feel her eyes on him every time she walked past, like a subtle acknowledgement of the mistake she had made, but with no real apology, no recognition. Just a cold, polite formality. That's what it had been, polite but distant. A brief glimpse of what he used to see in the world before fame clouded everything. His thoughts wandered back to his past, the moments when he felt invisible in his own skin, in a world where he was expected to be something bigger than life itself. The years of playing roles that weren't quite who he was, the constant struggle to balance the person he was with the persona others wanted him to be. Those were the years that shaped him. The years that made him realize the fleeting nature of fame, of recognition, of the masks we all wear. Keanu exhaled deeply and closed his eyes for a moment, leaning his head against the window. Maybe it was the solitude of this private jet, or maybe it was just the growing realization that no matter how far he flew, he couldn't escape the weight of his past. It was always there, waiting for him when he least expected it. Just as he was beginning to lose himself in the rhythm of his own thoughts, he heard footsteps approaching from behind. He turned slowly, his eyes catching the woman once again. This time, however, her expression had changed. There was no longer the cold professionalism she had worn earlier. She seemed hesitant, almost unsure. "Mr. Reeves," she said, her voice tentative, her tone softer than before. I owe you an apology." Keanu raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the sudden shift in her demeanor. "There's no need," he replied. "I understand. These things happen." But she didn't seem convinced by his nonchalant attitude. She stood there for a moment, looking down at her feet before meeting his eyes again. "I know who you are," she said, almost as if she were trying to explain herself. "I should have recognized you when I saw you. I'm really sorry for the way I treated you earlier." Keanu smiled, a small, knowing smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's all right. Really. You were just doing your job." But the woman shook her head, almost as if she couldn't let it go. "It's not just that," she said quietly. "I've been working here for a while now, and I've seen a lot of celebrities come and go. I didn't expect you to be so down to earth. I guess I thought that because you're famous, you'd be," she faltered, clearly trying to find the right words. "Well, different." Keanu's expression softened. He had heard it all before, the assumptions people made about him because of his fame. But there was something about her honesty, the way she had admitted her mistake, that made him want to ease her discomfort. "I get it," he said gently. "It's easy to think that way. People expect something else from you when they know who you are. She nodded, looking down for a brief moment. I shouldn't have judged you like that, she muttered. It was wrong. For a brief second, there was a silence between them, a pause that seemed to stretch on as the realization of her actions sank in. Keanu didn't rush to fill the quiet. Instead, he let her sit with it. After all, it wasn't his place to offer comfort. But in some small way, he realized this moment had shifted something for both of them. The woman, now visibly uncomfortable, shifted her weight from foot to foot. If there's anything I can do to make this right, she trailed off, clearly not sure how to proceed. Keanu looked at her for a long moment, his gaze steady but kind. You've already done enough, he said, his voice quiet but genuine. Sometimes, people just need to be reminded that we're all human. That's all. Her eyes flickered with something like understanding, and for the first time, she seemed to relax a little. Thank you, she said, almost as if in disbelief. I'll let you get some rest. I just wanted to make sure you knew I wasn't trying to be rude. Keanu gave her a small nod as she turned to leave, a weight lifting off his chest. The tension that had lingered between them was gone, and in its place was something far more powerful, a mutual understanding. For the first time on this flight, Keanu felt a shift, not just in how the woman saw him, but in how he saw himself. He had never been one to crave validation from others, and yet, this moment, this small exchange, had reminded him of something he had forgotten over the years. He wasn't defined by his fame, by the roles he played, or by how others saw him. He was defined by his actions, his integrity, and the choices he made in the face of the world's expectations. And that, he realized, was far more important than any seat on a jet or any movie premiere. As the jet continued its journey through the clouds, Keanu leaned back again, this time with a sense of quiet satisfaction. The tension of the day had melted away, replaced by a calm that only moments like these could bring. This wasn't just a flight to somewhere unknown. It was a journey to rediscover himself, and in some strange way, to understand the people who crossed his path, even if it was only for a brief moment in time. The jet cruised higher, cutting through clouds, the hum of the engines a distant background to the whirling thoughts that churned in Keanu's mind. The moment he had shared with the woman, her apology, the honesty in her voice, had left him in a strange, reflective state. In his years of fame, he had rarely been confronted with someone so candid, so human. He had always been treated with a certain reverence or fear. But this felt different. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to sink into his thoughts. What did it mean to be famous? To have your face plastered on billboards, your name spoken in the same breath as legends, but still feel like you were fighting for something deeper? Something real? Keanu didn't expect answers, but there was something about this flight, about the chance encounter with the woman, that made him wonder if, just maybe, he could find peace. If he could separate himself from the persona the world had built for him and just be. But as much as he tried to ground himself in those thoughts, something jolted him from his reverie. The plane began to shake lightly, a sudden turbulence that sent ripples of unease through the cabin. Keanu tightened his grip on the armrest, instinctively looking out the window. He could see the faint shadow of a storm ahead, dark clouds looming in the distance. It was then that the unease deepened, because the turbulence wasn't the only thing that had shifted. A voice came through the intercom, interrupting the silence. Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered some unexpected weather, the captain's voice crackled. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts. We'll get through this shortly. Keanu's eyes narrowed, sensing something wasn't quite right. The jet's smooth ride had turned into a jarring, unpredictable shake. The cabin crew moved swiftly down the aisle, ensuring that everyone was secured in their seats. But there was something in their movements, something that felt off. The woman from earlier, Keanu still didn't know her name, appeared again, this time with a more hurried, concerned expression. She was moving with purpose, but her eyes betrayed her unease. Everything okay? Keanu asked, his voice calm despite the growing tension in the air. He had faced far worse in his life, after all, but the sudden shift in the atmosphere left him on edge. Her eyes flickered to him for a split second, then darted away, as though she hadn't expected him to speak. "We'll be fine, Mr. Reeves," she said, her voice more strained than before. "Please just stay seated. We're going to ride this out." Keanu nodded, but his attention was elsewhere. He watched the crew move in and out of the galley, their actions faster now, more purposeful, as the turbulence continued to shake the jet. He couldn't help but notice the passengers' uneasy faces, some of them gripping their armrests, their knuckles white, as others stared out the window, trying to calm their nerves. And then, as if the turbulence wasn't enough, the power went out for a brief moment, and the lights flickered. The jet's engine sputtered, an ominous sound that echoed through the cabin. The woman, now standing near the cockpit door, her posture rigid, paused for a moment, her eyes scanning the room, trying to read the mood of the passengers. Keanu caught her glance again, this time not with judgment but with understanding. She was just as unsettled as everyone else, but she had to maintain her composure. His mind raced. Something wasn't right. The odds of something catastrophic happening were slim, but in this moment, a gut feeling told him to stay alert. He couldn't shake the suspicion that this was more than just a simple glitch in the flight. The turbulence rumbled again, stronger this time, and Keanu felt a sinking sensation in his stomach. The woman from earlier didn't return to his side. Instead, she hurried down the aisle, clearly trying to calm the passengers, her steps quick and purposeful. The other crew members were on edge too, visibly moving with more urgency. Keanu's heart rate picked up. His mind flashed back to his experiences in Hollywood. The quiet moments of crisis he had faced when the cameras weren't rolling, when everything had felt as fragile as the turbulence now rocking the jet. But this wasn't a movie. This wasn't a scripted disaster. This was real. For a brief moment, everything seemed to slow down. The fear in the eyes of the passengers, the unease in the crew's faces, the muffled voices from the cockpit as the captain communicated with the flight attendants. The last whisper of calm before everything became a storm. Keanu closed his eyes for a moment, trying to center himself. His breathing slowed. His mind focused on the sensation of his hands gripping the armrest. He had been through a lot in his life. Heartbreak, loss, the constant scrutiny of being in the public eye. But this felt different. He wasn't just facing an external crisis. He was facing something within himself. A fear that had nothing to do with flying, and everything to do with his own doubts about the life he had built, the life he was now trying to leave behind. The voice on the intercom crackled again, but this time, it was different. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain said, his voice tight and strained, "we've encountered an issue. Please remain calm. We're making adjustments and are doing everything we can to ensure your safety." Keanu opened his eyes, but this time, the turbulence was worse. The plane dipped slightly, and for a split second, the ground felt closer than it ever had before. It was in this moment of vulnerability, as the plane swayed through the storm, that Keanu realized something important, something that shook him to his core. No matter how much fame or success you have, when you're in the air, there's nothing that can guarantee your safety but the sheer will of others working tirelessly to make sure you land on solid ground again. The rest of the flight was a blur. Keanu couldn't remember exactly when the turbulence subsided, or when the lights came back on. He only knew that, when the jet finally settled into smooth air again, something within him had changed. There was no great revelation, no dramatic realization, just the quiet, humbling knowledge that the most important thing, when facing the unexpected, was to hold steady, no matter what. The smoothness of the flight had returned, and the jet, once again, glided through the sky as if nothing had ever happened. The brief period of chaos seemed to fade away like a distant memory. The steady hum of the engines was comforting now, almost soothing, as though the turbulence had never occurred. But Keanu knew better. He knew that those moments, those few minutes of uncertainty, would stay with him for a long time. The cabin had returned to its calm state. The passengers, who had once been tense and fearful, now seemed to relax. Some had their eyes closed, others conversing quietly, but all were visibly relieved. The crew moved through the aisles, their movements less hurried, but still maintaining the kind of professionalism that Keanu had come to expect from those in the service industry. But as the minutes ticked by, Keanu couldn't shake the feeling that the storm had done more than just rattle the plane. It had stirred something deeper within him. His own fears, his own vulnerabilities. The crash of the turbulence mirrored his internal conflict, a storm of uncertainty he had been trying to ignore for far too long. Keanu glanced out the window again, the world beneath him an endless sea of clouds. Everything looked so small from up here, like life was happening far below, and he was merely a spectator. A faint sense of detachment washed over him. It was as though the sky had stripped away all the noise of the world, and all that remained was the rawness of his own thoughts. The woman, whose name Keanu had still not learned, had returned to the cabin after the turbulence had passed. She moved with a sense of calm now, but her eyes met his briefly, and for a moment, there was a quiet acknowledgement between them. No more awkwardness, no more tension, just two people who had shared a moment of vulnerability and come out the other side with a better understanding of each other. Keanu watched her for a moment before she disappeared into the galley, and he felt a small shift within himself. She had reminded him of something important, that no matter how big your world may seem, or how small the world of others might appear, we all share the same sky. We all face storms in our own way, and we all try to find our footing again when the storm passes. As the flight continued, Keanu began to reflect on the lessons he had learned over the years, the ones that had shaped him into the man he was now. The wisdom he had gained from both the highs and the lows of his career. The heartbreaks, the losses, and even the triumphs. They had all brought him to this moment. In a way, the turbulence had been a gift. It had forced him to confront something that had been lurking beneath the surface for years, the constant battle between the man the world expected him to be and the man he wanted to be. And while the storm had rattled him, it had also given him clarity. Keanu leaned back in his seat, his eyes closing for a moment as he allowed himself to process everything. The fear he had felt earlier was no longer there. Instead, there was a quiet sense of peace, a deep understanding that no matter what the future held, he was ready for it. Maybe it was the reminder of how fragile everything could be. Maybe it was the realization that fame and success could never fill the empty spaces within us, no matter how hard we tried to convince ourselves otherwise. What mattered was the people who truly saw us for who we were. What mattered was the ability to be kind, to be real, and to embrace those fleeting moments of vulnerability that allowed us to grow. As the flight neared its destination, Keanu found himself feeling lighter. The weight of the world, the expectations, the pressure, it had all been temporarily lifted. For the first time in a long time, he felt as though he could just be. He could leave the world of fame and illusions behind, even if only for a few hours, and be the person he had always wanted to be, authentic, unfiltered, and at peace. The woman appeared one last time before they began their descent. This time, her demeanor was completely different. She had a warm, genuine smile on her face, and when their eyes met, there was no longer any awkwardness. Only the shared understanding of the human experience, the highs and the lows, the moments of tension and the moments of release. "I just wanted to check in," she said, her voice soft. "We're almost there. Everything looks good from here." Keanu nodded, giving her a small smile. "Thanks," he said, his voice calm. "I appreciate it." She paused, her eyes studying him for a moment. "I'm glad we got through that together," she said, her tone sincere. Keanu felt a small warmth spread through him at her words. "Me too," he replied. As the plane began its final approach, Keanu sat back in his seat once more. The journey was nearly over. The storm had passed. But the lessons of the flight, lessons about vulnerability, kindness, and the importance of staying grounded, would stay with him far longer than any turbulence ever could. In that brief moment, Keanu realized that perhaps the most important journey he would ever take was the one inside himself. A journey toward self-acceptance, toward embracing his humanity, and toward finding peace in a world that demanded so much. As the wheels touched down on the runway and the plane slowly came to a stop, Keanu felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of calm. It wasn't a perfect resolution. Life never was. But in that moment, he had found what he needed most, a sense of clarity, of understanding, and most importantly, of peace. The jet had just touched down, and the familiar hum of the plane's engines powering down signaled that they had arrived. Keanu was momentarily stunned by the sudden silence, as if the world had briefly stopped to let him catch his breath. He stretched his arms, feeling the tension in his muscles that had built up during the flight. He'd been in this position countless times before, landing in cities across the world, but today felt different. As the crew prepared the cabin for disembarkation, Keanu sat for a moment longer than usual. His mind was still drifting between the layers of the flight. What had happened with the turbulence, the exchange with the woman, the new clarity he was beginning to feel. It was almost as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. It wasn't that the problems he had before had disappeared, but they suddenly seemed more manageable, more human. Just as Keanu stood up, ready to leave the plane and step back into the chaos of the world, he caught a glimpse of the woman who had helped guide the passengers through the turbulence. She was standing by the door now, her eyes scanning the cabin for any last-minute needs. For a split second, their gazes met, and for a moment, it felt like the rest of the world had faded away. There was an unspoken connection between them, something that neither of them had expected. The woman smiled at him, the warmth in her expression palpable. Keanu nodded back, the faintest smile tugging at his lips. He didn't know why, but something inside him made him take a few steps toward her. The desire to thank her, to acknowledge what had passed between them, was stronger than he anticipated. "Hey!" Keanu called softly, his voice low, the hum of passengers disembarking around them. She turned to him, startled, then relaxed when she saw who it was. Her smile grew a little wider. "Mr. Reeves," she greeted him with a polite but friendly tone. "Is everything okay? Your seatbelt was on so tight during the turbulence. I just wanted to make sure." Keanu waved his hand, cutting her off. "I'm fine. Really. I just wanted to thank you. You were incredible back there, keeping everyone calm in the midst of that chaos." Her eyes softened, and she shook her head as though she wasn't sure she deserved the praise. "It was my job. You didn't need to thank me." Keanu took another step closer, his expression more sincere than he had intended. "But you did more than just your job. You were human in a way that made everything feel a little less terrifying. And honestly, I've been on a lot of flights, but I've never seen a crew handle something like that with as much grace as you did." She looked at him for a beat, and then a hint of a laugh escaped her lips. "I've always said the best way to deal with turbulence is to make sure the passengers feel like they're still grounded, even when everything else feels out of control." Keanu laughed too, the sound of it light and genuine. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was having a conversation that wasn't driven by his fame or his status. It was just two people talking about something real. "Yeah, I guess that's the secret to surviving the storms, huh?" Keanu said, his eyes meeting hers once more. She nodded, her smile softening. "Exactly. We all have our own storms to weather. And sometimes, it helps to know that someone else is there, riding it out with you." Keanu felt the weight of her words settle in his chest. He had always been the one people turned to for strength, the one they looked to for answers or comfort. But in this moment, it was her strength that had reminded him of the value of simply being there for others, of sharing the experience, even in its uncertainty. Before Keanu could respond, a flight attendant came up behind her, nodding respectfully. "Excuse me, ma'am. We need to make sure everyone gets off the plane." The woman glanced at Keanu and gave him one last warm smile. "It looks like we both have places to be. Take care, Mr. Reeves." Keanu nodded, stepping back, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this interaction had meant something more. He had seen thousands of faces, interacted with countless people, but something about her had cut through all the noise. As he made his way down the aisle and out of the plane, Keanu found himself thinking about their brief exchange, about how, despite the craziness of the world, there were still moments of human connection that grounded you. Moments where, for a brief instant, it wasn't about who you were or what you did. It was just about two people recognizing something in each other that transcended all the external layers. As he exited the jet and stepped onto the tarmac, Keanu took a deep breath of fresh air, feeling more alive and present than he had in ages. He could see the bustle of the airport in the distance, people rushing past him with their own destinations and priorities. But for a moment, he wasn't thinking about the next stop on his journey. He wasn't thinking about the pressures of his career, the interviews waiting for him, or the script he had to memorize. All that mattered in that instant was the quiet realization that, sometimes, the most unexpected encounters could change you. That sometimes, all it took was a brief moment of connection to see the world a little differently. Keanu gave one last glance at the jet, his mind turning over the events of the past few hours. He didn't know if he would ever see the woman again, or if their brief encounter would mean anything in the grand scheme of things. But one thing was certain, she had reminded him of something important. We're all just trying to stay grounded, even when the world feels like it's spinning out of control. As he stepped away from the plane and into the terminal, Keanu felt lighter than he had in years. Whatever came next, he was ready for it. The next few days in the city passed in a blur for Keanu. As always, his schedule was packed with meetings, interviews, and rehearsals. The usual whirlwind of his public life. Press events, photo ops, and promotional tours took over, but something had shifted in him. He found that despite the chaos, the conversations with strangers, the fans who recognized him from a mile away, none of it felt as pressing as it had before. His thoughts kept drifting back to that moment on the plane. The turbulence, the calm woman who had somehow grounded him in the middle of the storm. It wasn't just her professionalism that had stood out to him, but the way she had connected with him. In the midst of the adrenaline and fear, she had offered something rare, genuine human connection. Keanu had never been one to reach out to people he didn't know, especially not in such vulnerable circumstances. But something about the way she had made him feel, seen, heard, and understood, was like a light bulb flicking on. He hadn't realized just how disconnected he had become from the world outside his own fame, his own bubble. That feeling didn't just dissipate after the flight. It lingered in his thoughts, quietly nagging at him, urging him to do something different. It wasn't about fame or career anymore. It was about remembering what truly mattered, what had been missing in his life for so long. Real, authentic connections. A few days later, Keanu found himself sitting in the back of a car on his way to a promotional event. The streets outside the window blurred as the city rushed by, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't ignore the nagging sense that he was living in a world of distractions, an endless cycle of obligations and expectations, and that he had long since lost touch with his own true self. The phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He pulled it out and saw that it was a text from his publicist, reminding him of the upcoming event. But instead of immediately responding, Keanu found himself staring at the message for a moment. The usual routine seemed like a distant echo now, something far removed from the clarity he had found during that flight. For a brief moment, he thought about the woman, the crew member from the jet. What was her life like? Was she still going through the motions of her job, dealing with the same daily grind? Or had she, too, experienced something that would stay with her long after that flight? Keanu didn't know the answer, but he couldn't shake the curiosity. On a whim, he tapped the screen and started typing a message. He didn't know if it was appropriate, or if she would even remember him, but the desire to reach out was stronger than his hesitation. "Hey, it's Keanu, the guy from the jet. Just wanted to say thanks again. You really helped me out back there. I don't know if you're open to it, but I'd love to grab a coffee sometime. Just two people talking about life. No pressures. Let me know." Keanu stared at the message for a few seconds. Should he send it? Was it too forward? Too personal? He almost convinced himself to delete it, but then he thought back to the connection they had shared, the brief but significant interaction. If he was going to take anything away from that experience, it had to be the willingness to put himself out there and take risks. So, with a deep breath, he hit send. The car slowed to a stop outside the venue where his event would take place. Keanu pushed the phone back into his pocket, his heart thumping a little faster than usual. He knew he couldn't expect an immediate response, or any response at all, but there was something liberating about the simple act of reaching out. It was a step forward, in more ways than one. The event went as expected. The usual smiles, the red carpet, the flashing cameras. But throughout it all, Keanu found himself feeling disconnected from the manufactured nature of it all. The artificiality of the conversation, the repeated questions he had answered 1,000 times before. It all felt like background noise to the new clarity he had found. He had spent years building a career in this world, but now, more than ever, he realized that it wasn't the world he wanted to inhabit exclusively. There was something missing, a deeper sense of connection to the people and the moments that truly mattered. When the event concluded, and he was back in the car headed to his next destination, his phone buzzed once more. This time, it was a reply. "Hey, Keanu. I remember you. That flight was one I'll never forget. I'm glad to hear from you. I'd love to grab that coffee. Let me know when you're free." A smile tugged at the corners of Keanu's mouth as he read the message. It wasn't a grand gesture, not by any means, but it was something meaningful, something real. He quickly typed back, arranging a time and place to meet. He couldn't predict where this would go, if anywhere at all. But what he had learned was that sometimes, taking a chance and putting yourself out there is the most important step. As the car pulled up to his next destination, Keanu's mind wasn't on the press conference waiting for him. It wasn't on the rehearsals or the interviews or the pictures that would be snapped. It was on the small, unexpected connection he had made, one that had the potential to shift his perspective on everything. In that moment, Keanu realized that while fame had opened doors for him, it was the moments of human connection, like the one he had shared on the plane, that truly made life worth living. And maybe, just maybe, it was time for him to seek more of those moments. The morning of the coffee meeting, Keanu woke up early, feeling an unfamiliar sense of anticipation. It wasn't like him to be nervous about something as simple as meeting someone for coffee, but today felt different. There was a lightness in the air, something fresh and hopeful, and he couldn't quite shake the feeling that this was more than just a casual meetup. He spent a few minutes picking out his clothes, something simple but still casual enough to keep the pressure off. He wasn't worried about looking perfect or making a lasting impression. This wasn't a meeting with a director, a producer, or a reporter. This was just a moment between two people, the kind of moment he had been craving but hadn't realized until now. After getting dressed, Keanu checked his phone one more time. She had sent a follow-up message confirming the coffee shop in time. Everything was set. As he walked out the door of his hotel and into the crisp morning air, he felt a surge of excitement mixed with curiosity. What would they talk about? Would it be awkward? Or would it flow naturally, like it had on the plane? When he arrived at the coffee shop, it was almost exactly as he had imagined. Quiet, cozy, with sunlight streaming in through the windows. The kind of place where you could sit for hours without being disturbed, just lost in conversation. He glanced around, looking for her, but didn't see anyone who looked familiar. Then, his phone buzzed. "I'm here. Just spotted you. I'll be right over." Keanu smiled to himself, pocketing his phone. He looked up just as she walked through the door, the woman from the plane, now standing before him in casual clothes, looking entirely different yet somehow the same. There was a sense of calm around her, a grounded aura that seemed to match the atmosphere of the coffee shop. She approached him with a small, welcoming smile, and Keanu rose from his seat to greet her. "Hi," she said, her voice warm and friendly. "It's nice to see you again, Keanu." "Likewise," he replied, the words flowing out more easily than he expected. "I'm glad you could make it." She took a seat across from him, and for a moment, they just smiled at each other. It felt like no time had passed since that day on the plane, and yet everything about this moment felt new and full of possibility. "So," she began, her eyes searching his for a moment, "how have you been? How's everything, after the flight?" Keanu leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of her question. He hadn't really talked to anyone about the turbulence, the way it had affected him, but in this moment, it seemed right to open up. "It's funny," he started, glancing out the window for a second before meeting her gaze again. "That flight, the way everything went down, it really made me think. I've been going through the motions for a while now. I've been surrounded by people, but somehow, I've felt disconnected, you know? Like there's always something missing, something deeper." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I think I understand. I guess it's easy to feel like that sometimes, especially in our world where everything is so fast-paced. We forget to really connect." Keanu looked at her, a little surprised at how easily she understood. Exactly. And I think what really hit me was how you handled everything on the plane. It wasn't just the professionalism. It was you. You made it feel like I wasn't just another passenger. Like I mattered. She smiled, a little sheepishly. Well, I try my best. But I'm glad it helped. I think sometimes we forget how much power there is in simply being present for someone. In acknowledging that they're going through something, whatever it is, and just being there. He paused, processing her words. It was strange how simple yet profound they seemed. He had been surrounded by so many people in his life, but it wasn't until now that he realized how much he had been missing real human interaction. The kind of interaction that didn't involve cameras or flashing lights or the expectations of others. Can I be honest? Keanu asked, leaning forward a bit. I've spent so much of my life trying to be something for other people, whether it's for my fans, my colleagues, my team. But in doing that, I've lost track of what really matters. What's been right in front of me all along. The woman's eyes softened, and she gave him a knowing look. It's easy to lose sight of that, but you're not alone. Everyone has those moments. The real challenge is realizing it and taking steps to change. Keanu nodded, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. There was something incredibly reassuring in hearing those words, something that made him feel less isolated in the complexities of his life. They spent the next few hours talking about everything and nothing, their favorite books, places they traveled, their childhoods. It was the kind of conversation that felt effortless, the kind where time seemed to slip by unnoticed. Keanu found himself laughing more than he had in months, his thoughts flowing freely without the pressure of performing or meeting expectations. Before long, the coffee cups were empty, and the cafe was starting to fill with the lunch crowd. Keanu looked at his watch, realizing that he had to leave soon. But he wasn't ready to say goodbye just yet. I can't tell you how much this means to me, he said, his voice sincere. I know it might sound strange, but meeting you, this whole thing, it's been a reminder of what really matters. I've been caught up in my own world for too long, and you helped me see that. She smiled, standing up as well. I'm really glad I could help, Keanu. I think you're already on the right path. Just keep listening to yourself, and things will fall into place. As they walked outside together, the afternoon sunlight casting long shadows on the pavement, Keanu felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He wasn't sure where this new journey would lead him, or if he'd see her again, but he was no longer concerned with the uncertainty. What mattered was that he had taken the first step, and that was enough. Take care of yourself, she said, offering him a warm smile before turning to go. Keanu nodded, watching her walk away. Then, with a sense of renewed clarity, he turned toward his next adventure, whatever that might be. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. How do you think this meeting has impacted Keanu's outlook on life? Will it change his perspective permanently, or is it just a momentary shift?